Good afternoon and welcome to our July webinar. We'll be talking today about building resilient communities and looking at some of the latest research and tools and frameworks that are out there where you can learn more information. The presentation today is being conducted by myself, Linda Nelson. I'm the ICOR president. One of my jobs is to serve as a volunteer on different technical committees in international standards organizations. So I represent the United States in the Technical Committee 268, where they look at community resilience in the context of sustainable development. I also am a member of Technical Committee 292, which is looking at business continuity, organizational resilience, as well as community resilience. And I also serve on a task force that coordinates work between the Technical Committee 292 and the UNISDR. Our objectives today are to really look and understand the power of local and community resilience strategies. I want you to think as small as you can when we talk local. We are also going to look at how community resilience is increased when there is an intentional effort to increase the disaster preparedness of the community. We're also going to look at different community resilience frameworks and where you can go and learn more about those. We could probably do a webinar on each framework individually, but essentially what we're going to do is show you some different ones, get your interest and see where you can learn more. Also look at some tools on how you can do a community resilience self-assessment. And just as a reminder, just like all of our recordings, they'll be available usually within 1 or 2 days after the webinar. You can find those on our webinar homepage. And our webinars are available usually for 30 days to anyone, and then after that they're part of our library, and anybody who's a member can view all of our webinars on their own demand. Remember that you have a questions button. So if you have a question as we're going, please use the questions button. I will try to answer them at the end of the webinar, or if I can't get to it, then I will send an email to everyone who's attended and provide the questions and the answers. I want to start by just looking at the term community. I usually start my webinars with some kind of a definition, and this is, not just to start off really boring with every webinar, but the fact is that understanding common definitions is really an important baseline. And so one of the challenges with looking at what I'll call community resilience is that it's also called lots of other different things, like urban resilience or city resilience or neighborhood resilience. There's all kinds of different terms being used out there. So when you're searching for these things, you have to sometimes use more than one search term. But we've decided in ICOR to use the word community because we think that the definition of it is broad enough to include, rural, urban, city, whatever, neighborhood, in that a community is a place-based group of people. And notice we're going to be talking today about the importance of the people in your community, who have some kind of meaningful capacity to influence their basic common needs given their particular social and political context. This is a very, very broad definition of community, but I think it is helpful for our discussion today. I've been asked to talk a little bit louder. I did see a note come in, so I will attempt to talk a little bit louder. So I said that we were going to start with the power of local, and local is really important. And there's a great paper and study done at postcarbon.org, and you can see it referenced here. And they've done a lot of work on community resilience. And their findings really are that building resilience in communities is best done at a local level. So if you have a really, really large community and, you're going to want to get to its smallest component perhaps. So it is at the community level where we most directly interact with the people and organizations that make up our society. And I want to give you an example where I live. So I live in the United States. That's one piece of my community. I would consider that to be a large community. Maybe I'm even part of North America, for example. But But then I live in Illinois, which is a state in the United States, and I live in a suburb of Illinois called Lombard. But actually, I'm also part of a county, DuPage County. So when I looked at how I could impact the resilience of my community, I went to my region, which was our Lombard City Council, and they told me to go to the fire department because evidently they were in charge of our community. And they then told me to go to DuPage County. Well, DuPage County is one of the largest counties in all of Illinois, second probably to Cook County, which makes up the city of Chicago. And that was too big. There wasn't the things that we were trying to do, we couldn't do working at the county level. We needed to be at our own small town level of 40,000 people. So when you're looking at what your community is defined as, you really need to look at something as local as possible. This is where innovation happens. This is where you have your social capital, where you have your relationships with your people. It's where you get things done, and this is where you have the most interactions, and it's also where you can get the best feedback and where you can have the most impact. Post-Carbon says that the responsibility for resilience building and the power to decide how it's done is ultimately rests with its community members, and we're all part of one or more communities, as I just gave in my example. And then the process of resilience building must also be equitable. I never thought about this, that it needs to equitably address both the particular situation of the community and the broader challenges of facing society. So here's another term. When I sit on the Technical Committee 292, it used to be 223, and it was about society, and which was another term for community. And what do we mean by society? That's why I really like the word community. I think it fits the best for what we're trying to talk about. But this process of resilience building, looking at, what are we resilient against? What are we trying to protect ourselves from? Where are we vulnerable? And then what are some challenges that face our community itself? And that's going to be dependent on where your community is located. If you're looking at natural disaster type things, if you're looking at environmental things or economic things, they're all going to be different based on where your community lies and its strengths and weaknesses. The Post-Carbon also went on to look at what are kind of the 6 foundations of building community resilience. And not surprising, the first one is we have to begin with its people, because the power to envision the future of the community and build its resilience resides with its community members. And if you've heard me talk on any other webinars, ICOR is really about systems, and we believe this firmly because it's about systems, which is how you make changes. Making changes to individual things might work for a short term, but things don't change long term unless you've got a system in place for this. So you need to be thinking like a system and looking at the complex interrelated crises, for example, that might be unfolding now and what they might mean for our similarly complex communities. I'm going to be talking about community resilience in a minute, but one of the things that you're probably already seeing is this focus on resilience against disasters or crises. And that is important, but hopefully by the end of this webinar, you're going to understand that it's more than just that. But one of the challenges is that this is what people are looking at, and this is what nations and larger international organizations are also looking at this from more of a disaster lens, and so that's where a lot of the work is. But you also need the third foundation is really this ability to be adaptable, and remembering that any challenges that you face are dynamic and communities are dynamic. It's not staying the same. And so this idea to be adaptive and agile is an ongoing process. I also like the word transformability. Some challenges are so big that it's not possible for the community to simply adapt, and you need to have fundamental transformative changes. I was in the Philippines a few years ago, and I had the opportunity to attend a conference and listen to a mayor of a community on one of the islands that makes up the Philippines, and they had a problem because they were having a volcano. And this volcano would erupt. And so one of the challenges was they couldn't get the people to move from the volcano. So because they'd been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. So what they did was they built a new community, and then they had to entice people to move there. So they found you can't stop the volcano from erupting. You can't move the volcano, but you could move the community. And so that's what they attempted to do. And that's a whole story in itself, and it was somewhat successful. But, it is hard to get people to move. I'm sure you've heard about the term sustainability. And I talked about this a little bit with the systems thinking. Your community resilience is not sustainable if it only serves us and if it only serves you right now. So you need to work with other communities because your community is part of a larger system. And whatever you're doing needs to be making sure it's sustainable for the future. And of course, it does take a little bit of courage. We all know people that don't want to talk about things that haven't happened or that might happen or that could cause them pain. So both as individuals and as a community, we need the courage to confront challenging issues and to take responsibility for a collective future. So postcarbon.org has identified this as really those foundational things. And what you might see in international standard might be principles, for example. So these requirements are in dynamic tension with each other because together they task community members with acting beyond their own self-interest, and they really are the starting point for everything else that comes forward in looking at community resilience. Another institute that has done some nice work under the banner of sustainability is the Institute for Sustainable Communities. And they wrote a paper on, what is community resilience and why does it matter? And so they looked at things that you need to strengthen with the community. So they're looking at cultivating certain aspects. And the first one is the economic. So understanding that a resilient economy cultivates multiple employers that are constantly innovating and evolving. I'm sure you've all lived in a company town or heard of company towns where they've got one employer. That's tough. I mean, your whole economic future is based on one employer. So having that diversity in your economy is important. Also, your community is impacted by the health of its environment. I'm sure no matter where you've lived, you've heard of Detroit, Michigan, here in the United States, that has bad water. The water is polluted and they can't drink it. So the health of its environment and access to natural resources is important. We're also seeing problems in places that don't have enough energy. They can't generate enough electricity. This is happening not just in rural communities, but all over the world. Some of the social aspects, we're going to be talking about that, and the people in the community have found to do better when they have a disaster, when they have good social networks and connections. But also remember that the social aspects, you've got community-based organizations who represent the most vulnerable and disadvantaged populations in our communities. And sometimes they don't have a seat at the decision-making table, but they play a really important, critical role to maintaining those social networks that help bring the whole community together. So make sure that your table in your community is big enough to ensure that all those groups are represented, which means you actually have to be having a conversation about this with people within your community. And then we've talked a little bit about diversity, but if you're relying on one industry or one roadway or one power line or one water source, you're going to be vulnerable. And some of these things you might not be able to change, but you can try to reduce your vulnerabilities in order to be able to increase your communities, I keep wanting to say organizations, innovation and adaptability. One of the things I want to point out here is that I often talk about organizational resilience, and a lot of the things that we're talking about regarding community resilience can also be addressed and be applied to organizational resilience as well as individual resilience. I really like the study that was done by Stanford. What they did is Stanford University, they looked at some different epidemics that have occurred over the last couple hundred years all the way from the Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919, and they look specifically at Norway and how that the doctors were required to report the disease actually impacted the illnesses in that community and how the community responded to the Spanish flu. And so one of the quotes I really liked was that you need glue to bind a community together. So we're looking at that social network piece. But you also need WD-40 to reduce the friction because there's always going to be conflict. And so, keeping people together, working together, and also resolving conflict is an important aspect of that. And so building on that, what they really found is that most resilient communities appear to be those that have a wide variety of deeply rooted cooperative organizations, often made up of your medical community, your educators, your religious leaders. And then what you need to do is to build resilience into that social system and making sure that the more that those are diverse, the better the community, or the greater capacity that community has to solve its long-term problems, not just fighting disasters. Like I said, I don't have time today to take deep dives into different community resilience programs, but these are all local programs. I think most of these are in the United States, but I'm not positive. But this community resilience organizations, I really like I never thought about CROWS, that they took their acronym and they made a picture from it, which was cute in my opinion. Also the Community Resilience Collaborative, this was done with a grant in Texas. The Building Community Resilience is an education site that you can take a look at, as well as a Neighborhood Empowerment Network. I liked this one because it didn't use the word resilience, and it focuses on this idea of a social network and being a neighborhood, making people feel like they're part of a group. So I'm now going to move to actually the definitions for community resilience. There's tons of them, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I just picked 4 of them that I particularly like the best, that I think give us the best, not just the best definition, but the broadest scope. So the RAND Corporation, they've defined community resilience as a measure of the sustained ability of a community to utilize available resources to respond to, withstand, and recover from adverse conditions or situations. So here you've got them looking at their resources, being able to be sustainable, and of course, being reactive to adverse situations. CARI is another really great organization that's done a lot of work on community resilience, and they define it as the capability to anticipate risk, limit impact, and bounce back rapidly through survival, adaptability, evolution, and growth in the face of turbulent change. Now, if you've listened to other ICOR webinars, you probably have heard me talk about change actually being a risk factor and not managing change being a risk factor. And being able to effectively managing change actually make you much stronger as an organization. So here's, you see the tie to change and adaptability, but they're also talking again about being resilient to things that could happen to you and being out there with anticipating risk and planning ahead of time so that your impact is limited. I've just been talking about the Post-Carbon Institute, and their definition is the ability of a community to maintain and evolve its identity, and they do a lot of work on identity in the face of both short-term and long-term changes while cultivating environmental, social, and economic sustainability. This one's also really interesting. They, like I said, they do some work on the term identity. Who are we? What do we want to do? Where do we want to be? How do we want to get there? They focus on change, and then they also draw the importance of your environment, social, and economic sustainability. And I would, be remiss if I didn't bring up the International Standards Organization's definition. And here it's the ability of a community, and they substitute in here organization or individual, to absorb and adapt to a changing environment in order to enable it to deliver its objectives and to survive and prosper. So again, we've got this ability to absorb and adapt. We've seen that all through the other definitions as well, tying this to change and making sure it can deliver its objectives. This is one piece that I don't think actually is in the other definitions, and I think it's really, really important. Whatever the purpose is of your organization or community, you're able to deliver its objectives. So you're surviving what's ever happened to you, whatever that is, and then prospering because of it. So this PLOS, I don't really know what the acronym stands for. They did a study, and they reviewed 80 relevant papers. And they found, again, no agreed-upon definition. But what they did identify was that each definition has value and has led to contributions within that domain. So people are looking at resilience from a certain lens. For example, the Department of Homeland Security has done some work on community resilience, but they're looking at it from the infrastructure lens. So you have a lot of different organizations looking at community resilience from a specific focus. So if I could compare this to how people look at organizational resilience, they might be looking at it from a business continuity aspect or risk management aspect or communications piece or from a supply chain risk piece or whatever. That we have all these different lenses, or I should say IT, which is probably the biggest lens. And that's what's happening with community resilience as well. People are looking at it from a subset. I guess that's what I want to call it. When I talk about lens, I'm looking at subset. But it is important for each community to define its own definition because it needs to reflect the way it's going to be used. And that's something I want you to remember is sometimes a focus on those individual elements might be really helpful to you so that you can make progress and we'll talk about indicators and, missions and objectives and those sorts of things. But, we don't really care about finding the exact concept. What we're trying to do is increase the resilience of your community. That's the outcome that we're looking for. So as part of that, you just need a definition that'll work for you. So what they then did was they looked at different types of definitions, and they put them in different buckets or multiple buckets. And they said that you've got process definitions. So a definition that's looking at an ongoing process of change and adaptation. We also looked at the absence of an adverse effect, like the ability to maintain stable functioning, the ability to be sustainable, to reduce the impact, that type of thing. And then a range of positive attributes in their definition. So like a broad collection of response-related activities, especially if they're more of a disaster-related definition. So they found 9 common elements in those definitions. One of them talks about local knowledge and this importance of local knowledge. So that, remember I said that community resilience needs to be addressed at a local level. So the community itself needs to understand its existing vulnerabilities and how they can reduce those vulnerabilities. And just, there's a lot of sub-elements within this, but just having a really good understanding of what they're vulnerable to or what they're vulnerable from, as well as what are their strengths, what can they leverage. I'm hoping that by the time we're done with this webinar that you'll be very clear on the importance of the community to have networks and relationships. So you need to have relationships within its members and also to be connected to the larger community, whatever the bigger group, like I talked about my town or I guess it's I don't know if it's the city of Lombard or the village of Lombard being connected to our county. But we also have, different towns that are connected right to us. It used to be different towns all separate. Well, now, if you live in the Chicago area, everything's connected. So how can we build networks within our different community members? When we're looking at organizations, we talk about, how can you have relationships with other organizations to strengthen you? It's the same sort of thing with communities. Also, it's essential to have effective communication. We hear this over and over again with anything, that how important communication is. And I think this is actually something that even though we have many more ways to communicate, in some ways I think that we're actually getting worse at this. If you're looking at younger people and they don't communicate the same way, those of us that have been around for longer communicate. And using those different tools and learning how to use those different tools are really important. So I belong, like I said, I live in Lombard, Illinois, And one of the things that we have is that there's a couple different Facebook pages. So I decided to join those, and I'm finding out all sorts of things that are happening in Lombard that I wasn't aware of through signage and other things. But I'm also finding out, I know it sounds silly, but somebody's lost a dog, or somebody, found something on a hiking path or at a park, and they're looking to see whose it is, or, why is the fire department, why are all the fire trucks racing to the south side of town? Just really, did anybody sustain damage from the last storm? Do you need any help? That type of thing. I think having effective communication in your community also helps you to bring those networks and relationships together. I thought this health element was really interesting. So they're talking about health as well as the health of the community itself, but also looking like availability of healthcare services and being able to deliver those during normal times, as well as during a crisis or something. And so making sure that you have access to health services is really important. We also talk about, of course, governance and leadership. Usually that's the number one thing, and that's why I was kind of intrigued by the fact that they list this as number 5. That, of course, you need governance and leadership to help, handle crises, things, and help to, run your community itself. They've divided this into infrastructure and services, as well as public involvement and support, and looking at how effective and efficient they are to respond quickly, as well as how capable they are. So looking at that, having that infrastructure in place to manage something like a disaster at a certain capacity level. I also liked their definition of resources. I tend to think about resources as food, water, first aid, whatever, shelter, equipment that you might need. But don't forget about your natural resources, the physical resources, the human resources, and the financial resources, as well as we've talked again about the social resources within your community. What kinds of resources can we draw upon in your community? Looking at the economic investment, I actually think that the reason when I went to my community and volunteered my services to be part of there was a study being done out of Michigan State, and I wanted to be able to implement it in our community. And why I was sent on my merry way to, my county was because they just didn't want to make the economic investment into what I was suggesting to them, which actually wouldn't have been much of an investment except that it took time and resources. And they didn't want to do that. But looking at, if a community has a disaster, that long-term economic challenge is really important. And I know you always hear about communities not being able to balance their budgets, not being able to meet their budgets, having to borrow. And that's the reality of communities all over the world. And so how do you get economic investment in strengthening your community to be resilient against disasters? How do you get funding for preparedness? We all look at this because I'm assuming that most of you are listening to this because you've got an investment in being prepared at one level or another. But you need to have your individuals in your community prepared. You need to have your government prepared. You need to have the organizations in your community prepared. If the organizations in your community can't continue to deliver their goods and services, how is the community going to be able to meet everybody's needs? It's just not possible. But they do have a responsibility to be prepared as much as they can. And the last element I thought was really intriguing was this idea of mental outlook. It wasn't talking about mental health. We're talking about outlook. What are and I would almost call this the culture of your community. We talk about the importance of the culture of your organization. But what are the attitudes, feelings, and views when facing uncertainty? So, or even contemplating a future one. And, you have to be looking at their attitude towards uncertainty. And, do you have the right leaders in place? Are your community members able to look at challenges without becoming, overly stressed? So I want to stop for a minute and get your opinion on what you believe to be the primary or most important aspect of defining community resilience. So please go ahead and choose one. Do you think it's the ongoing process of change and adaptation, an ability to maintain stable functioning, or a broad collection of response-related activities. Which one of these do you think is the most important? So while you're doing that, we have a couple of questions. One of the questions is, can we say that by definition that Carrie and Rand that we have a proactive and reactive community resilience approaches? I would agree with that. Yeah, some people are more about responding after than preparing ahead of time. And the second question is, what is the ISO standard or document used for the citation of the definition of community resilience? So in Technical Committee 292, and I'm going to keep the poll open for about 10 more seconds, they have a standard called 22300, and this is a open source document. So if you just do a Google search for ISO 22300 and type in community resilience, you can get the definition from there. It's not something that you have to buy or purchase. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and I will share it. This is really interesting that I thought it would kind of be distributed evenly throughout these, and in fact, choosing one I thought was going to be a little bit difficult. 63% of you said that you believe the primary most important aspect is the process of change and adaptation, and I feel like that's a really big win. That means that people are really looking at resilience from a much broader piece than just responding. I don't mean just. I shouldn't say the word just, because if you've been in a community disaster, it isn't just responding. But I think we finally are getting to a point where people are understanding that you need to be stable, you need to have a broad collection of response-related abilities, but you also need to have an ongoing process for change and adaptation. So thank you for participating in that. I do like this graphic. It doesn't come through very clearly, but here's where they're talking about the city resilient. What are the critical elements of neighborhood resilience? So here they're actually combining neighborhood and city in the same definition. So the RAND organization has put together they've identified 8 levers or means of achieving community resilience. And what they've suggested is that you should implement activities related to these 8 levers, and that they help to move a community closer to achieving community resilience through an ongoing process. And I should probably mention that community resilience, just like organizational resilience, is not a fixed state, and you're never, we made it, we're there. It's always an evolving process because of, like we just said, this importance of managing change. So we'll kind of start from the top and work our way down. Wellness and access contribute to the development of the social and economic well-being of the community and the physical and psychological health of the population. So here you're seeing those 9 foundations that we talked about a few minutes ago being tied here to wellness and access. And then education can be used to improve effective risk communication. It also can be used to improve engagement and community self-sufficiency. It can help you to build social connectiveness, as well as help you to build partnerships to ensure governmental and non-governmental organizations are integrated. And then their last 2, quality and efficiency, they use those as ongoing levers that cut across all the other ones. And they consider quality and efficiency probably to be the cornerstone and core components of community resilience, and looking at the importance of monitoring your quality and your resource efficiency in order to help you develop those local community resilience building plans. And by the way, the example of this that we've given you here is how Los Angeles County has implemented this RAND model. So you could go ahead and take a look at that. And by the way, Los Angeles County is a huge county. So when I talk about local, their local is bigger than my local, but they're a huge community, so they had to start somewhere. FEMA in the United States has put together some community resilience indicators, and what they've moved to, instead of the response building, which is really the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they're trying to look at capacity building. So they're moving forward in their thinking as well. So they're looking at how can you support the intrinsic community functions that are also critical for absorbing, rebounding from, and adapting to local hazards. They're also looking at facilitating hazard-based community preparedness, risk management, and mitigation actions that reduce their long-term vulnerabilities. So this is really the before piece, is capacity building. And then enabling the post-disaster community recovery and redevelopment that integrates your community resilience objectives when you actually have a disaster. They've looked at some details behind their community building indicators, looking at access and functional needs, reminding you that there are populations with access and functional needs challenges that we need to address as part of our capacity building. We need to have a capacity to adapt to and recover from incidents that can impact your local or regional economy. That you need to look at your capacity to adapt to the impact to your public health and public health infrastructure. Your housing. What's your housing stock? Do you have affordable housing? Do you have accessible housing? How much is available? In some communities, you've got way too much housing available because you've got economic challenges. In other communities, there really isn't anything extra. My sister lived in a community in southern Indiana that she moved in, and 3 weeks later they had a tornado that knocked down about 25% of all of their housing. But because their community was undergoing a lot of other challenges economically, there was actually housing available for all those people that had lost their homes. So the other people that were trying to sell their houses were actually in a decent place. That's not really the way you want it done, but your community needs to be looking at its accessibility to housing as well as its affordability. And then looking at sustainability. What's your energy use? What's your commodity consumption? What are your other related activities that are tied to how what are your building codes for sustainability? What kind of planning are you doing on your community side? What kinds of resilience building are you doing? And then don't forget, of course, your social connectiveness. So hopefully what you're going to be seeing throughout this presentation today is reoccurring themes. And that's one of the things that I found most comforting, was that no matter who was building these different indicators or frameworks or whatever, we're seeing a lot of common ideas. And these ideas might be reflected using different terms, but the concepts are really the same. So this idea that you have to have formal and informal social networks and you have to engage people. The UNISDR put together a disaster resilience scorecard, and they identified 10 essentials, and they've divided them into these 3 categories: corporate or city governance, integrated planning, and then response planning. So they look at this idea that you need to organize for disaster resilience, you need to identify, understand, and use current and future risk scenarios, and you need to strengthen your financial capacities, all part of the governance piece. Then you need to look at your urban development and design. I gave that, kind of huge example in the Philippines of actually trying to move people from, a community that isn't a place that's healthy for them. But what is how are you designing your communities? What about safeguarding your natural buffers? What kind of protective functions do you have in your natural ecosystems? If you're where I'm living right now, I'm looking at Lake Michigan, and we've had 100-year records in the lake. The lake is rising, and so what is that doing to our natural buffers as it floods? And the Mississippi River has been flooded in a flood zone now for, I think they said, 5 months. How does that impact your community? Looking at strengthening that institutional capacity for resilience, looking at your actual organizations that manage that. Your social capacity, we've talked about social networks, and then the infrastructure, like I said, the Department of Homeland Security in the United States is looking very specifically at infrastructure resilience. And then moving to response planning, you can ensure effective disaster response and expedite recovery and build back better. So when you look at their scorecard and their 10 essentials, it's really intended to enable cities to establish a baseline measurement of their current level of disaster resilience And then identify priorities for investment and action. And then track your progress. How are we doing? And so using this scorecard, and you have to look at it, of course, in much more depth, but it gives you some way to do like a self-assessment and help you with planning and moving forward. And they have a scale of 0 to 5, where 5 is best practice. So just like kind of a maturity model approach. So I'd like to take our next poll and help you, and which organization has identified a disaster resilience strategy that makes the most sense to you. And here you're going to be comparing RAND's 8 levers, or levers, depending on how you say that, FEMA's Community Resilience Indicators, and then the UN ISDR's Disaster Resilience Scorecard. And I completely understand that you haven't had a chance to dig deep into these. But it gives you an idea of what makes sense for you, because each of you live in a different community, you work in different communities, and depending on what country you're in and what government structure you have, it's going to impact what strategy is going to work best for you. So I'm going to leave it open for about 10 more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and close this. I was actually expecting this one to kind of lay just where it is. I was actually expecting more for FEMA because there are more people on the call today from the United States, just because of the time zone issue. We get about the same number of people participating outside, after the webinar is over, just because they're not awake right now. And the FEMA would be the most commonly known in the United States. Outside of the U.S., the UN ISDR's Disaster Resilience Scorecard is really, really popular. And I like how RAND has been able to demonstrate, really through its Los Angeles County one, on just how to do something that meets the needs of Los Angeles County. It's been implemented in other cities as well, but I think that one has given the best. There's more out there to learn about it online. So I'd like to share with you ICOR's Community Resilience Framework, and I'm going to start with this framework. We developed this in 2006, and then this version of it was created in 2016 because, like everybody else, we were also learning more. And as more and more research is being done on community resilience, we also have to adapt and change and update what we have. But what I'd like to really challenge you to do is if you see things, resources, reports, studies, things that we haven't currently either shared in this webinar or included in this library here, I'd like you to go ahead and please donate or share that resource. So this is an open system. You can click on each one of these. So if you want to click on a healthy environment, it'll give you research on how a healthy environment impacts the resilience of the community and how you can go ahead and try to build your capacity or strengthen that system. So I would just this is a network, and we can improve what we have by having you share with us as well. So we assert that there's 5 primary systems upon which each community functions, and what we've really done is take all the work that's out there and create something that we thought made sense. And you're going to see that most of these frameworks are talking about really similar things. They're just putting together different pictures for how they do that. But we felt that this worked for a community no matter its size. And these individual systems that I'm going to talk about in a minute, if an individual system is weak, it's going to make the community more weak. And if it's stronger, it's going to make that community stronger. So let's go ahead and look at the individual ones. We've talked about the environment needing to be healthy. A healthy environmental system protects and restores a natural resource base upon which its life depends, and it seeks to reduce climate impacts. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Through adaptation and mitigation efforts, in order to increase those resource efficiencies. You need to have a healthy ecosystem and habitat. You need to limit the amount of pollution in your water, air, and land. And you need to look at how you can recycle things, for example. You need to have a responsible governance structure And the system provides community services. A responsible governance system enforces laws humanely, protects its community members, and manages its finances and meets its budgets under those changing conditions. And really looking at making sure it provides the services such as transportation, power, energy, water, wastewater, and communication systems. These are systems that communities need in order to survive, much less thrive. When we're looking at having a strong economy, a strong economic system provides necessary resources. They have a diversified economy. They have access to financial and physical resources. And of course, you maintain the value of its currency. It doesn't do much good if you're in an economic system that's failing and your money isn't worth anything. We've all heard stories about that in the past years. But mainly having this diversified economy that can support the sustainability and that you're managing the necessary resources. So you can see that each one of these systems overlaps with the others as well because they are part of one larger framework. I can say, when I was younger and looking for a place to live and raise my family, I was looking at quality of life for the community where I was going to reside. I wanted to make sure it had access to education and information. I wanted to have access to affordable housing and quality health care. I wanted to make sure I had social freedoms where I lived and access to employment and prosperity. So these are things that need to be part of a community itself where people want to live. And this is the prepared system is where we saw our most changes in what we had put in. We had made an assumption that being prepared was included. And what we found is that it has to be an intentional activity. So the community itself has to look at its preparedness and look how it reduces risks, how it funds those activities, making sure that you've got networks and partnerships in times of need, making sure your community members are educated on how to be more prepared, and making sure that organizations within the community are recognized for their resilience initiatives. So this is something that we're going to talk about, some of those recognitions in a few minutes. Rockefeller Foundation has created a city resilience framework that it's an output of that one from the UNISDR thing that we just talked about a couple of minutes ago. And they talk about our resilient city is a city where there is or are minimal human vulnerabilities, where you've got diverse livelihoods and employment, effective safeguards to human health and life, collective identity and community support. Again, we're talking about that network piece. Comprehensive security and rule of law, a sustainable economy, reduced exposure and fragility, an effective provision of critical services, reliable communication and mobility, effective leadership and management, empowered stakeholders, and integrated development planning. So here is their City Resilience Framework report that I think it came out in 2018. I'm not positive of the year, but you can see how this City Resilience Framework overlaps with the framework of what ICOR has put together as well, looking at it a little bit differently, but with some of the same outcomes. In their framework, and this is a really great document, I would recommend reading this. Just having images like this is really, really helpful. So they've put together these 4 dimensions or categories, which is health and well-being, economy and society, infrastructure and ecosystems, and leadership and strategy. Then they've put together 12 goals. So each one of these dimensions has 3 goals. And then they've identified qualities of behaviors. So like in ICOR's organizational resilience model, we've got behaviors that we're using. So these are very similar to that. And then in addition, they've got indicators. So we're going to go ahead and look at each one of these briefly. And I would just recommend that you spend some more time with these, because now you've got 4 or 5 or 6 indicators within each one of the goals that they have. So on their health and well-being indicators, you can see they've got those 3 indicators, and then you've got the 3 goals, and then you've got the indicators for each one of those goals. And we don't have time to read through all of them today, but you can get an idea of how they're giving you examples of how you can minimize human vulnerability, how you can create diverse livelihoods and employment, and how you can make sure that your safeguards to human health and life are effective. Same thing for economy and society indicators. So here they've given you indicators for that. Your infrastructure and ecosystem indicators, and how can you reduce your exposure? How can you reduce your fragility? How can you make sure you've got critical services provisioned? How can you make sure that you've got reliable mobility and communications? Looking at leadership and strategy, and again, I'm really happy that they didn't start with this. It's not all about leadership sometimes. It's about the systems that you're building. So making sure you've got decision-making in your government, you've got multi-stakeholder collaboration, for example, that your stakeholders are empowered, so you've got adequate education, community awareness, ways for community members to engage with the government, and that you're actually doing some development planning, your zoning, your land use, all of those sorts of things. And then what they've done is they've taken these qualities, and then you measure against each one of those indicators how well you're meeting those indicators by these qualities of inclusiveness, integration, reflectiveness, resourcefulness, robustness, redundancy, and flexibility. And then the last rating system that I want to talk about is the STAR community rating system. This has been in place since 2012 in the United States. And I would think even if you're not in the United States, you could make use of their rating system, and you might not get their little logo, the STAR community rating, and you can get a rating of 3, 4, or 5 stars. And you can go ahead and go to their website, and you can see all the different cities and what their STAR rating is. So if you're in your company and your company is looking to add a location or move a location, I would want to know what are the capabilities and capacities of the community where we're going to put this versus just getting a tax break. I think sometimes our organizations don't look enough into the capabilities of our communities to actually serve us before they move. It's oftentimes about, where can we reduce our wages that we have to pay people, or reduce the amount of money it costs us in taxes or in whatever. So what they've looked at is their built environment, and they've got 7 indicators for that. They've got climate and energy, economy and jobs, education, arts and community, your equity and empowerment, your health and safety, your natural systems, and then your innovation and process. So again, you can see really similar things to what we saw with the other frameworks. So let's take our last poll. And this one is, you've got, these 3 tools, the Rockefeller's City Resilience Index, the STAR Community, the 2 tools that we've shared today, the STAR Communities Rating System. And if you know of another one, please share during the questions one. This is the one that I was really struggling with finding other rating systems. The Economist has a benchmarking index, but it's just for the economic part. And that's the other thing, is we're finding different benchmarking tools or rating systems, but they're only on one particular area. They're not looking at the whole entire community. But even if you have some they're somewhat limited, go ahead and share those as well. We had a couple of other people ask a question. One question was, can you explain a little bit more about the concept of diversity in community resilience? What about social inclusion? So yeah, I think that we have to talk about both things. You have to include everybody in your community, make sure that everybody is being taken care of, and make sure that everybody's included in this. But you also have to look at diversity, meaning diversity of your economy, diversity of your leadership people that are running your community, diversity in housing. Do you only have multi-million-dollar homes in your community, or do you only have apartments in your community, or only subsidized housing? These things are really important because you need diversity in your schools, and you can't have diversity in your schools if you don't have diversity in your communities. And I know that some people want to be, especially when you're looking at communities, you only want to be in a really wealthy community, but there's things that you miss out on for that as well. There was another one, that's been shared, something called C40 systems, the urban climate action that also impacts the framework. And by the way, there's so much stuff being done on climate change that you can grab onto, that if you're looking more about, more of the risk management things, there's a lot of stuff being done on climate change that we could leverage for this as well. So the Rockefeller City Resilience Index got most of the votes. I like them both, but I think that the City Resilience one by the Rockefeller, I think, is broader, and I agree with you that it can be used, much more relevantly outside the U.S. than just within the U.S. itself. So I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts for the day. How will you use this information in your job? Think about your role in your job. Maybe you don't have actually any impact on where your company is located, where it puts its data centers, for example. You would think they'd be looking at energy resources in a community with data centers that uses up so much energy. How we use this information as a community member as well. So when you're looking at your organization as part of a community, but also looking at yourself as a community member and how you might impact that. And I kind of challenge myself that the program at Michigan State University isn't there anymore, so I can't bring that as a tool for us to use. And my community doesn't have any sort of way for me to be involved. But, could I go back and try again now that we have new leadership there? It's been 8 years. Maybe I would get a different answer. So I always like to leave you with a challenge. What can you do with this information? And how can you, maybe you don't have any impact on your community itself, but can you attend, meetings in your community when they're talking about an issue to see if you can leverage that to have a way to have an impact? So just to summarize for today, there are many definitions of community resilience, and they're often tied to a single aspect of what makes a community more or less resilient. But also understand that a community's resilience is impacted by many variables, and it is not a constant state. It's not something that you're going to do and get to, but it's something that you're always working to improve on. Building your capacity is a phrase that I like. There are different indicators for measuring that current state of community resilience. So your definition and how your community wants to look at community resilience is going to impact which tool or which measurement you might want to use to measure your current state and how to make improvements. But also remember that there's no single approach to increasing your community's resilience, and each of them requires an intentional effort, which is really why we went and rebuilt our community resilience framework to include that preparedness system, because it's a really, really important system, no matter the size of your community. So we've included all of the different references, so you can take a look at this. A couple of them I didn't include in the presentation, but I thought that were really good references and things to look at, but they were a little bit narrower. One was, I mentioned The Economist. They have a document that's really forward-thinking to 2025 on where you can, and it's sponsored by Citigroup, but where you can find resilient cities economically and how you might increase the resilience of the economy through that lens. And then NIST in the United States has a 6-step planning guide for community resilience that's really focused on infrastructure resilience. That's a little bit narrower, for example, than the one by the Rockefeller one or the UNISDR. We have 3 webinars coming up. Our August one is more technical, high availability versus disaster recovery. September 25th is looking at one about managing risk through management systems, and it's going to be a little bit broader than just management systems, but I think that's an adequate title. And then our October one is improving data center efficiency. We haven't identified our November one, and we won't be doing one in December, but if you have an idea of something that you'd like us to speak on and present on, please feel free to do that. Also, I wanted to mention that what we've been trying to do this year is write a newsletter or a blog. It's our iCorrespondence newsletter on each of these topics, either just before the webinar or just after the webinar. So if you'd like to look at that, you can click on iCorrespondence newsletter on our homepage as well. That is the end of the slideshow. We have 1 minute left. I don't think I can answer. There's one more question talking about, are there various approaches for culture divergent? I'm not sure what that means. So Abraham, if you could maybe send me a note on that one, what you mean by that, I could maybe answer that one better for you. I'm not quite sure of the question. Thank you very much for your time today. And remember that you'll get a certificate of attendance for your CEUs that'll come out sometime later this week or early next week. And we hope that you can attend our next webinar. Thank you.